Chapter 1. A Murder in the Garden. Carriage. If I, Captain Hastings, had been asked before that bright spring afternoon what constituted an ordinary Sunday at St. Aubin Manor, I should have answered with the complacent trivialities of cricket scores, luncheon plans, and the inevitable dispute over the new electric bell. Instead, what began as a promise of genteel society dissolved into a spectacle so bizarre that even Poirot, with his little gray cells already alert, allowed a faint crease of curiosity to appear between his perfectly arched eyebrows. The manor was hosting the annual garden gala, a glittering affair where silk and lace mingled with the scent of roses, and the carriage paths shimmered with polished wheels and silvered mirrors. The jewel of the display was a curious new attraction, an old-fashioned garden carriage, on loan from a collector in the south of France, which had been rigged as a whimsical, driverless demonstration. The inventor, Monsieur Lucien Marceau, a gentleman of precise tastes and an accent as clipped as his linen, had assured the guests that the contrivance was entirely safe. A marvel of concealed mechanisms and balanced weight, designed to move on its own along the gravel path, guided by subtle forces no one but the inventor fully understood. It was in the pale light just after tea that the incident occurred. The carriage, white, with carved roses etched into its panels and silver lanterns gleaming like wide-open eyes, was to perform its demonstration for the assembled company. Monsieur Marceau, with a flourish, released the subtle catch, and the carriage began to drift, as promised, along the path without visible impetus. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the guests. Lady Dresford, resplendent in emerald, clutched the fan at her throat, while her brother, Colonel Finch, watched with the stiff posture of someone who had seen too many battles to be awed by mechanical legerdemain. Poirot, who had been quietly observing from the margin, his mustaches unperturbed, leaned slightly toward me. "Hastings," he said softly, "note how the lady's right hand trembles a very little. Not fear, mon ami, something else. Observe the man in the background, the young Mr. Langley. He has his left foot tapping, but his eyes are fixed not on the carriage. Curious, n'est-ce pas?" Before I could formulate a reply, the carriage, instead of slowing at the appointed point, shuddered, as though having struck an invisible obstruction, then swerved with a jolt and came to rest against the low hedge bordering the old oak garden. A small gasp passed through the crowd. Monsieur Marceau hurried forward, his face pale beneath its powdered veneer. "Nothing, nothing," he declared with the brittle assurance of a man whose reputation trembled like crystal. "It must be a fault in the mechanism. We shall correct—" Then came the sound, a soft, almost muffled thud from within the carriage. The murmurs ceased. The silver lantern on the right clinked against the glass, as if shaken by a sudden tremor. Poirot's eyes, those beady, unblinking little windows, were now fixed directly on the closed door of the carriage. "Open it," he said, and his voice, usually smooth as silk, carried a slight, quiet insistence that made even Lady Dresford stiffen. Monsieur Marceau, hands trembling now, drew aside the delicate drapery and turned the handle. The door protested in a little creak and gave. Inside, reclined as if in a grotesque parody of sleep, was the body of Sir Reginald Haversham, the celebrated financier whose investments touched the lives of half of London's aristocracy. His face was turned toward the small window, a look of startled surprise frozen there. His fingers, white and spread, clutched at the cushion. There was no outward wound. That was the first thing one noticed, and yet from beneath his collar dark and still, a thin trickle of something, not blood, oozed with a slow discretion, like smoke curling from a candle burned too low. A silence heavier than any I had ever known in the drawing-room of a country house in the days of war fell. Even the distant children, who had been playing near the fountain, stopped and stared. Poirot stepped forward with that precise, measured gait of his. He put his gloved hand lightly on the back of the carriage seat, then withdrew it without comment. He moved to Sir Reginald's face, and for a moment I thought he would touch the body, but he did not. Instead, he closed his eyes, as if taking in, not with sight, but with something deeper. Sir Reginald's silk cravat had a faint smear, no, not a smear, but a suggestion of dampness, a slight discoloration on its inner fold. His left glove lay on the floor of the carriage, the fingers slightly bent, and in the folds of his coat a monogrammed handkerchief had slipped partly out, the edge damp in a different place than the cravat. Lady Dressford had gone pale as the lilies near the fountain. Colonel Finch's jaw worked once, twice. Mr. Langley, whom Poirot had so keenly observed, looked away quickly, as if the carriage had become a mirror revealing too much. "Well," said Poirot softly, loud enough for the nearest to hear, "it is not a simple accident. Sir Reginald Haversham, the financier whose name had been whispered with gratitude and resentment in equal measure in the clubs of Pall Mall, was dead, and the garden carriage, which had been meant as a charming piece of mechanized amusement, lay like a stage prop around a tragedy. The authorities, who had been present in the person of Inspector Grady, an earnest fellow with a notebook already in hand, moved in with official briskness, but Poirot raised a thin, admonishing finger. "Inspector, you will allow me?" "S'il vous plaît," he said. "The Zeitpunkt is not yet ripe for your conclusions." Grady, accustomed to taking the lead in provincial inquiries, shot a quick glance at Poirot, a man who bore the reputation of solving puzzles with a detachment bordering on arrogance. "Monsieur Poirot," he said, "this was the carriage. The demonstration went wrong, and the poor gentleman, surprised, perhaps had some attack. The position inside is awkward. Perhaps heart failure, if we are to speak of natural causes." Poirot smiled, not broadly, but with the slight curl that would, later, be mistaken for indulgence. "Ah, but, Inspector, the carriage did not stop so. There is, how you say, a certain dissonance. Sir Reginald's hand, it is not the hand of one who has fallen in natural manner. Also, you see here—" He lifted the cloth slightly with the tip of his cane. "The back of the seat bears a very faint impression, as if someone had leaned very briefly and then withdrawn. And yet, there is no trace of a second person having entered or fled. Curious, oui? I felt a prickling at the back of the neck, that same sensation that comes when one knows one is in the presence of a design more complex than a mere mishap." The assembled guests were already forming their own quiet speculations, the wheels of their minds turning as if the carriage had become a mirror reflecting their own anxieties. Secrets, I knew even then, lay like layers of dust beneath the polished surface, waiting for the smallest disturbance to become visible. Poirot turned his sharp gaze to the observing company, and as he did, I saw him mentally take their measure. The amused interest of the young artist, Miss Evelyn Marsden, the guarded politeness of the vicar, Reverend Chalice, the restless energy of the actress, Madame Duval, and the fragile mask of civility worn by Lady Dressford, beneath which something akin to calculation flickered like a candle in a draught. "I shall speak with them," Poirot murmured to me, and his eyes gleamed, not with the frivolity of curiosity, but with the concentrated light of one whose work had just begun. Thus, what had come to St. Aubin Manor as a diversion became at once a study in human complexity. And somewhere beneath the layers of social grace, a blade, hidden, silent, had struck. The game, I realized, had commenced. Chapter 2. The first clues, the carriage, once a whimsical piece of mechanical theater, had become an unwilling tomb, and the soft rustle of silk and whispered conjecture was already weaving itself into a net around the guests. Inspector Grady, after a brief, polite protest, withdrew to the periphery with his notebook, while Poirot turned inward, letting the bustle settle into a quiet hum that allowed him to hear the smallest irregularity. He began, not with grand pronouncements, but with observation. First, the scene in the carriage was not as one would have expected from a man taken suddenly by natural death. The left glove, always the more formal hand in which Sir Reginald kept his business cards, was on the carriage floor, fingers curled inward, as if he had grasped at something and failed. His right hand lay limp, the palm turned slightly upward, and underneath it, a faint, powdery smudge, an odd, almost imperceptible residue that caught the light only when Poirot tilted his head in that particular angle of concentration. He did not touch, he only looked, and in that looking, a thought formed. "Monsieur Poirot," I whispered, "could that be the dust from the carriage's mechanism?" He inclined his head. "Perhaps, mon ami. Or the trace of another who has with great discretion placed a hand here and then withdrawn it. Note the absence of pressure on the right side of the seat. Sir Reginald." He leaned as if to speak to someone beside him, and then something stopped him. Very small things, but they say everything, yes? The inspector, not understanding the subtlety, was already speaking with Lady Dresford in a low tone, while a cluster of guests had moved closer, forming a loose semicircle, their polite distance covering a hunger for detail. Poirot asked for the carriage to be carefully lowered from its display position, so that the gentle slope of the axle might be examined. And then he requested the removal of Sir Reginald's hat, his watch, and the small leather satchel he always carried. All were done with a softness that contrasted with the quiet brute of tragedy. The satchel, when opened, contained folded papers, an embroidered card from a recent society ball, and a small sealed envelope. Poirot lifted the envelope with his thumb and forefinger, and in the pale, filtered light of the garden, turned it so that the seal, an intricate pattern of a lion and a crown, caught the sun. It had been broken. On the back flap, beneath the discarded seal, a smear of something, dark, thick, stained the paper, and a thin thread of silk, almost invisible, clung to its edge. Poirot's eyes narrowed, but he did not show a sign of alarm. Instead, he tucked it gently into a small glassine packet and placed it inside his waistcoat pocket. "Very discreet," he murmured to me. Someone wished to conceal a message. Perhaps, Monsieur Hastings, the message was not for all eyes, oui? And yet, why leave the envelope here in this carriage if the intention was secrecy? Suspense, no? The contradicting gestures of a mind trying to be clever. I moved to speak to the young artist, Miss Evelyn Marsden, whose sketchbook lay open beneath her arm. The plume of her pencil paused in mid-thought. She had been one of the first to notice the slight hesitation in the carriage before it stopped. "I saw it," she said in a quiet voice, "move a little improperly before the jolt. That is, not like it had struck anything, but like it had hesitated. And then Sir Reginald seemed to reach, not angrily, but as if to say something, and the carriage stopped almost too quickly. It was like watching a conversation frozen mid-sentence. Did he speak to someone? Poirot asked. I did not see anyone there, she answered, biting her lower lip. But I saw his eyes shift. There was a reflection in the little window, just a glint, not clear. I thought it might be the sun, but now Poirot's moustaches twitched. Reflection can betray a great deal, mademoiselle. What we see is not always what is. You are observatress. That will help. Reverend Chalice, meanwhile, offered his own testimony, with a discomfort that was disguised as clerical restraint. I was near the fountain, he said, his voice carrying that faint tremor of a man unused to public confrontation. I heard a soft, almost like a muffled cough, and then a slight rustle, as if someone had drawn breath sharply. I came forward, and the carriage was there. There was no sound of struggle. Sir Reginald's face, he looked as if he had seen something dreadful, but not in pain, more perplexity than agony. Poirot nodded, then turned his gaze to Madame Duval, whose eyes had not left the spread of gentlemen and ladies, mingling with polite disapproval. Madame, he said, you are an actress. You will know the difference between a gasp for effect and a gasp of truth. Did you see anything? Anything at all that in your profession would not belong to the ordinary? She lifted a hand, delicate as if sculpted from porcelain, and lowered her lashes. Monsieur Poirot, I noticed Sir Reginald's attention. It was fixed, not on the audience, not on the carriage, but as if toward the lower pathway, and there was a slight perfume, very faint, that mingled with the scent of roses, not the usual gardenia, something sharper. It made me think of expensive imported essences, like those used to mask other smells. It was gone in a moment. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, the mind places perfume as a mask or as an invitation. We shall see. Merci, madame. I, feeling the tug of the investigation and the gravity of the moment, sought out Colonel Finch. The man was standing stiffly by the hedge, arms folded in a manner that betrayed impatience beneath the illusion of control. You knew Sir Reginald well? I asked. Enough, he replied shortly. He was a man who made enemies and friends with the same handshake. I do not believe in coincidences, Hastings. That carriage, it was too contrived for an accident. Look at the way the mechanics were presented. Ornamental, ostentatious. Sir Reginald detested pretense. He would not have been amused if it were a simple failure. Something else pushed him. He would have spoken, but someone stopped him. He turned his head slightly toward Lady Dresford, whose fingers were now pressed together, their knuckles pale. She met his gaze without flinching. Poirot listened without interruption. He had already catalogued the smallest mismatches. The dampness on the cravat not matching the position of the body, the absence of an audible struggle, the broken seal of the envelope, the faint perfume, the hesitation of the carriage, the reflection in the window. All these, to the untrained eye, were mere fragments. To Poirot, they were notes in a melody that had been intentionally dissonant, waiting for the right ear to discern the pattern. He turned to me, with a softness in his voice that belied the steel within. The game, mon ami, is not of brute force. It is of the mind that believes itself unseen, and that mind has made small errors. We shall gather the others, but first, his gaze swept over the carriage one more time. We give time to the little things to speak. They always do, if one listens. Eh, Hastings? Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. Poirot did not rush. He let the hum of speculation swell into a manageable murmur. Then, with the deference of a conductor raising a baton, signaled that it was time the players be brought to the center of the stage. The garden path, once bright with laughter, now bore the quiet weight of restraint. Inspector Grady, who had been pacing with a habitual notebook in hand, was gently guided by Poirot to assist in assembling the company beneath the cool shadow of the portico. "One by one," Poirot said to me, "we must see their faces when they believe themselves observed. The truth, Hastings, is a creature of habit. It will reveal itself in the little twitch, the avoidance, the pause that is too long." His eyes, sharp as a needle, flicked over the group forming beneath the portico, Lady Dressford standing with the air of a woman who always commanded the room, her fingers now less serene, Colonel Finch, rigid as a statue burdened with suspicion, Miss Evelyn Marsden with her sketchbook closed now, yet her gaze unblinking, Reverend Chalice, whose hands seemed to clutch his notes as if they were a shield, Madame Duval in her graceful aloofness, Mr. Langley, the taciturn young man whose left foot had betrayed restlessness, and a new arrival, Mrs. Penelope Stratton, long-time friend of Sir Reginald, a woman whose quiet smile was frayed at the edges by grief and calculation. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot announced, his voice light, but with an underlying authority that made even the rustle of a gown sound like something deliberate. "We are in the presence of a most delicate situation. The gentleman, Sir Reginald Haversham, has been taken from us under circumstances that require attention more than appearance. I ask you all to remain. No one leaves. We shall speak calmly, and we shall together try to understand the peculiarities of what has occurred." Lady Dressford lifted her chin slightly. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice smooth as polished mahogany, "we all wish to assist. Sir Reginald was a man of many admirers and some enemies. Shall we begin with accusations, or with your questions?" Poirot smiled, the smile that was more like a polished instrument than expression. "With questions, madame. Accusations are noisy. Questions, they are precise. Colonel Finch, you were near the carriage when the incident occurred. You had known Sir Reginald longer than most here. What was your relationship with him in recent times?" The colonel's reply was clipped. "Business, mostly. He had connections, investments, and a particular talent for stirring society. We had a disagreement over, well, certain allocations. He believed in the expansion of a railway, I questioned. He did not take well to criticism." He glanced briefly at Lady Dressford and then away, as if the matter was already in the open, and therefore unworthy of further examination. Miss Marsden, who had been sketching faces with quiet precision since her arrival, now revealed a different light in her features. "I was to do a study of Sir Reginald for a commission," she said. "He agreed, reluctantly. He said he did not like being captured. He had been uneasy all afternoon, though he smiled at the others. His tension was not toward mechanical failure. It was toward being watched. He spoke to no one directly, but he did glance often toward the lower pathway near the old yew. I thought it perhaps fanciful. Now I think perhaps it was more than a glance. He was aware of something, or someone, there." Reverend Chalice adjusted his spectacles. "Sir Reginald attended the charity luncheon last month," he offered. He had spoken with Mrs. Stratton about a donation plan which, I confess, appeared to become contentious. There were suggestions of conditions, which she denied. I know nothing of the specifics, but there was mention of a will. Sir Reginald, he was not a man to leave ambiguities, yet he had said to me once, in private, that some of the most secure foundations are built on the shifting sands of trust. Mrs. Stratton, a woman of slender frame, now lifted her hands slightly in a gesture of gentle dismissal. "Reverend, you are poetic, but not always precise." Sir Reginald and I spoke. He was considering several items, and I had urged him to consider his legacy with clarity. Yes, there was talk of documents, donations, and yes, perhaps even phrasing. But that implies nothing untoward. He was a man who changed his mind, like the wind changes direction in the hills, frequently and with intent. Madame Duval's eyes, dark and reflective, flicked between the others and settled on Mr. Langley. "And you, monsieur?" she asked. "You appeared uneasy when the carriage halted. What brings you to St. Aubin? Are you of the family, an acquaintance, or a business associate?" Langley's jaw tightened. "I am a junior partner in one of the firms that Sir Reginald supported. I came because of discussions concerning a new venture in textiles. He had called me only yesterday to clarify certain promises. I admit I was nervous. He could be formidable, but I had no quarrel with him." Poirot nodded, then turned toward Lady Dressford, his gaze the quiet needle that pierced soft surfaces. "Lady Dressford, you have been close to Sir Reginald these last few seasons. He trusts you, or he trusted you, until today. You seem curious, perhaps interested, but also wary. What is it you found of note in his manner this afternoon?" She let her fan fall open in a languid flutter. He, like many of us, was tired of the usual negotiations. He had recently received a letter. Her voice smoothed over the word as if tasting it, which made him thoughtful. He spoke of change, of those who would inherit his attentions and displeasure. I thought it was the usual business of power shifting. He spoke, too, in a tone that suggested he felt someone was close to a revelation. He did not say who. Poirot listened, his little gray cells working not in isolation but as a harmony, as if each answer were a note, and he, the composer, began to hear a developing theme that promised dissonance. He allowed them to finish before he asked the final question that, like a gentle probe, would reveal more than a blunt attack. "Who among you," he asked with a softness that drew eyes, "had the opportunity to be near the carriage without attracting notice? Not that I accuse, but that I understand. A conversation held perhaps in passing that left behind the impression of a presence unspoken." A silence fell. The murmur of leaves stirred as if even the wind awaited. Eyes shifted subtly, some to the corners of the portico, others to the ground. Poirot, with a tiny nod, did not pursue that question further immediately. He had planted a seed. The moment, he knew, would grow in impressions and contradictions. As the group dispersed to allow further examination and time, Lady Dressford remained, her gaze drifting toward the lower pathway, and Mr. Langley, who had excused himself with a polite bow, paused and looked back once, just long enough for Poirot to catch the very brief flicker of something, regret or fear, before the mask of composure returned. Chapter 4. Poirot arrives. It would be a mistake, I soon realized, to think that Poirot's arrival had been merely physical. He had arrived fully when he chose the moment to move from observer to architect. Up until now, he had watched, collected, and measured. Now he stepped forward with a clarity that changed the shape of the room. The little gray cells which had been quietly turning now clicked together like the gears of a finely tuned mechanism, and the patience of silence felt the precise pressure of intention. He gathered the principal players once more beneath the portico, but this time with a different air. There was no need for persuasion. The gravity of the moment had made them inclined. He did not begin with the tragedy of Sir Reginald's death. Instead, with the soft, deliberate cadence that had become his signature, he spoke of what the world saw, and then of those things the world had not noticed. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, "you have all been very generous with your impressions. That is good. The mind that is false always gives too much or too little. I have observed many small things, but there is something the official story says which is not entirely right. Inspector Grady believes, perhaps with the natural desire for simplicity, that Sir Reginald's death was the consequence of surprise and accident. It would be easy, n'est-ce pas, to place the blame on the carriage itself, that convenient machine which has now become a character in our drama." He paused, and the soft rustle of the nearby magnolia leaves seemed to lean forward. "But moi, I have the honor to inform you that the machine did not kill Sir Reginald. The machine was a stage, and on that stage something was performed. The question is not who pushed the carriage, but who caused the pause, the hesitation, the moment when Sir Reginald's face changed from cordiality to something caught between intention and interruption. That is where the truth dwells." Lady Dresford drew herself up slightly. "You imply, Monsieur Poirot, that someone interrupted him? That someone spoke without being heard? That seems rather poetic." Poirot's moustaches curved in a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Poetry, madame, is simply truth with the unnecessary removed. The interruption was not always spoken. Some interruptions are gestures, glances, the placing of an object, a movement that says, 'Stop, you will not continue.' Sir Reginald's hand, his left hand, was in motion as if to communicate. Then he stopped. Something arrested him. We will come to that." Inspector Grady, who had been watching with a thin patience, shifted. "Monsieur Poirot, you said the carriage is only a stage." The mechanism faltered. The demonstration was altered. There was a strange sound from within. Could that not be indicative of a struggle, or of the victim's surprise at the carriage's movement? You say he was interrupted. By whom? There was no one in the carriage with him. There was no one physically in the carriage, Poirot replied smoothly, and yet there was a presence. Presence, mon ami, is not always weight. A look, a pause, a signal. The mind is capable of making another stop without touch. We are dealing with subtlety. He turned to me, and in that glance I saw the silent permission to go deeper. Hastings, you will remain close. I wish to learn tone and shadow. He then directed his attention to Mr. Langley with a small, polite inclination of the head. Monsieur Langley, you were near, yes? You had, how you say, interest in the movement of the carriage, and yet your gaze was elsewhere. You show a movement of foot, restless, when the attention of others is fixed. That is not guiltiness in itself, no, but it is the sign of one who walks a path and fears another's shadow. You told us you had business with Sir Reginald. Did he speak of something that made you uneasy? Langley flushed marginally, then answered with controlled restraint. He spoke of fulfilling obligations. Some were delayed, some were reshaped. He was exacting, as he always is. I was uneasy, yes, but not with him. With the possibility that in the shifting of terms promises would not hold. I did not wish to lose the chance to prove myself. Poirot's face did not betray amusement or doubt. He simply inclined his head and moved, almost imperceptibly, to the next subject, Madame Duval. You have the gift to see emotions pretense cannot hide. When Sir Reginald's face changed, what did you perceive? She lifted her eyes slowly. He was startled, not by the carriage, but by something beyond it. There was a minute delay between his glance and his reaction, as if he had seen something reflected, and that something was not himself. Then he pulled back, not fully turning, but enough to show hesitation. I have seen actors do less convincing performances. Poirot's gaze shifted, deliberate, to Lady Dressford. "Madame, the letter you mentioned, did it speak of people who were to inherit, or of those who would lose their place if the balance were altered?" "It hinted," she said, "at loyalties shifting. Sir Reginald questioned who would stand with him, and who would step aside quietly. He wished for clarity in a world that preferred shadows. That is all. And you," Poirot continued, turning gently to Mrs. Stratton, "were in conversation with him about phrasing. There's a difference between advising and guiding. Which one were you doing?" Mrs. Stratton's smile was thin. "I was suggesting precision. He wished to define. I have no more to add beyond that. He was a man who built, then reconsidered. Nothing more secretive than that." The questions, while seemingly casual, were not. Each pairing of name, memory, and nuance was a thread Poirot held and weighed. He was not yet pulling hard. He was feeling for the tension in the web, knowing that the right tug at the right moment would cause the pattern to reveal its hidden structure. Finally, he raised his hand with a softness that ended the exchange for the moment. "We shall speak again. For now, I wish that no one leaves the grounds. The day has grown both long and thin. The truth, mes amis, is patient. It will make itself known to those who do not force it. But listen, I will take my time." Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. The garden, which had been in its earlier hours a place of polite distraction, became under Poirot's direction a theater of examination. He did not summon them all at once this time. Instead, with the careful economy of a surgeon, he selected his first pair, those whose reactions had been most marked by smallness: Miss Evelyn Marsden and Monsieur Langley. He wished, he said to me afterwards, to begin where the ripples were faintest, for the faint ones often betray the first touch of the stone. We went first to the small summer house overlooking the lower path, a place shaded by ivy and heavy with the scent of damp earth. Miss Marsden sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes steady. The sketchbook closed but not forgotten. Poirot did not begin with accusations. He began with what she had seen, and then, as a painter blends color, he added gently shades of pressure. "You said," he began in his soft French cadence, "that Sir Reginald looked toward the lower pathway before the carriage stopped. You did not see a person, but you saw movement, a reflection. Can you tell me what caught the light? Was it glass? Was it one of the lanterns? Or was it something more, something deliberate?" She considered, then answered. It was not bright enough to be the lanterns. It looked like a glint, sharp, sudden, from a small surface. I thought perhaps he saw someone, then dismissed it. The reflection lingered for the barest moment, like a second image superimposed over his own. He turned his head, just slightly, as if to confirm, then stopped himself. That hesitation, he was about to speak, and then something held him back. Poirot's mustaches twitched. Ah, he saw something. Perhaps not a person, but a suggestion. A person might cast a reflection, or a device. Tell me, Evelyn, do you know about surfaces that show more than they seem to? Mirrors that are not mirrors? I have studied, she said, glass, light. It is possible to hide between layers, thin panes, reflections angled, One might see without the other seeing you. You could be in plain sight, and yet invisible. He may have thought he saw that, and that is what made him pause. Poirot tapped his temple lightly. The little gray cells are already suspecting. Merci. He turned, then, to Langley, who had taken a seat across from the low window, his fingers entwined, eyes cast down. Poirot's questioning of him was gentle in pretense, surgical in intent. "Monsieur Langley," he said, "you had conversation with Sir Reginald about obligations. That makes one anxious. Anxiety can color memory." When the carriage hesitated, you were watching its movement, yes, but your gaze was elsewhere. What else did you see? Langley swallowed. He mentioned the new textile arrangements. He was to decide whether to extend credit to a third party. I feared that if I failed to present the right information, promises made would falter. I watched the carriage because it was part of the demonstration, something to ground me. But I saw Sir Reginald's glance flicker. He was not surprised by the carriage itself. He was looking beyond. He changed, and he paused, clenching his jaw. I thought perhaps someone was playing with him. That is all. I did not move. I did not speak. Poirot's eyelids lowered in what might be called reflection. You, monsieur, felt a game being played. That is why your foot moved without the rest of you. Uncertainty. Merci. You were honest, n'est-ce pas? I believe so, Langley said, and the smallest crease of nervousness appeared. Then, smoothed with effort. Poirot then had me accompany him to the Rose Terraces, where Colonel Finch had taken a quiet, watchful stance, as if the geometry of the paths could contain the disturbance. The Colonel's answers were brief, but his demeanor had shifted slightly. Tension, like a taut wire, vibrated just beneath his composure. "Colonel," Poirot said, "you told us you and Sir Reginald had disagreements. Men in business talk of money and strategy. But often behind words there are resentments of a personal kind. Did he speak of having enemies? Did he speak of someone who might wish to stop him from speaking further, or of something he was about to reveal?" Finch's gaze dropped to the petals scattered by a passing breeze. He spoke of shifting loyalties. He felt, perhaps with reason, that people around him were not entirely what they claimed. He did not name names. He referred to a change, a disclosure that would unsettle some who had grown comfortable. He did not fear for his life. He feared that the consequences of that truth would ripple. I do not think he expected to die today. He expected agitation, not finality. Poirot nodded slowly. Agitation can be used as camouflage, no? A man unsettled is easier to misdirect. He did not press further at that moment. He collected, like a bee taking nectar, drop by drop. Our next interview brought us to a bright corner of the greenhouse, wherein Madame Duval had been found earlier, the trailing ferns throwing lace-like shadows over the stone floor. She had been careful, as only one accustomed to reading the small betrayals of others could be. Poirot eased in with a question about performance and truth. "You said," he reminded her gently, "that Sir Reginald saw something in the reflection, then pulled back. Actors hide much by showing less. You saw the hesitation. Was there fear, or was it recognition of something he knew and did not wish to acknowledge?" She leaned forward, her gaze softening. Recognition, yes. Not of a face he knew, but of a plan he might have suspected. He saw the possibility of betrayal becoming visible. He was not frightened for himself, but for what might be exposed. His withdrawal was an effort to keep that exposure from becoming clear. He followed that look with one of calculation, then of resignation. Poirot's fingers came together as if in prayer. Calculation, then resignation, the mind that prepares a defense, and the one that accepts the blow. Merci, madame. As the initial round concluded, Poirot stood in the center of the terrace, folding and unfolding his hands in measured rhythm. He did not declare conclusions. He did not hurry. He allowed the comfortable murmur of the garden to mingle with the tension, that both might camouflage his own attention while he quietly arranged the pieces in his mind. "He is careful," I murmured. "You can see he is assembling." "Oui," said Poirot, his eyes distant a little. "But the picture is not yet clear. There are voices, but the true speaker is not yet exposed. We continue, Hastings. We will let the others speak. The small things will cry out louder when the corners are filled." Chapter 6. First False Lead. It was inevitable, given human nature and the appetite for neatness, that the first answer offered to the murder would glimmer like a polished coin, bright, obvious, and dangerously misleading. The ripple that had been gathering since the morning's peculiarities swelled, and, in the middle of the afternoon, the current seemed to find a convenient bank. Mr. Langley. The hour had passed, and in the library, a high-ceilinged room smelling faintly of leather and beeswax, Inspector Grady presented what he believed to be a decisive piece. It was a telegram, browned slightly at the edges, as if it had been kept folded for some time, addressed in a hurried script to Sir Reginald Haversham. The content, read aloud with a tone of satisfaction, was brief and threatening in implication. Langley, it declared, had demanded that promises be kept or that the consequences would ripple into ruin. The telegram bore a signature, partially smudged, but to the provincial eye, unmistakably linked to Langley's firm. Alongside it was a report from the groundskeeper, who swore that he had seen Mr. Langley lingering near the lower path just before the demonstration, and that the young man's figure had appeared tense, shifting as if waiting, and then watching Sir Reginald with an intense, almost predatory focus. "It is clear," Grady announced, "that Mr. Langley had motive, financial pressure, threatened opportunity, and opportunity in the sense that he was observed near the carriage. The telegram shows the strain. He was in direct correspondence with Sir Reginald about these obligations. He had interest, and perhaps he took action when the man hesitated. The question now is not who could have done it, but whether Monsieur Langley will explain the nature of this threat." Langley, called forward, looked as if wind had been knocked out of him. Gone was the earlier cautious composure. He looked pale, his fingers unconsciously clenching and unclenching. "That telegram," he began, voice thin, "was a draft. I sent a milder version later, one in which I asked for patience. I did not intend—" He stopped, searching for words. He was expecting something from me. I was frustrated. Yes, I did not kill him. Lady Dressford, whose eyes had been on him like a hawk, gave a small, approving nod, as if order had returned to a place she preferred it to be. Colonel Finch watched with the satisfied curl of someone who sees a suspected enemy cornered. Mrs. Stratton's gaze was quiet, unreadable. Madame Duval observed with that detached air that, in its own way, carried its own accusation, her attention veiled rather than overt. Poirot, who had been standing slightly to the side, his hands folded in front of him, said nothing for a moment. Then he stepped forward with the gentleness of one offering a trinket. "Monsieur Langley," he said, "you sent a telegram that carried a threat in its tone. You admitted tension. All of this is true, and yet a threat spoken, even written with the heat of pressure, is not murder. The presence near the pathway, I accept that you were there. Why, then, did you not speak to him directly? If the promises of credit and consequence were so urgent, why hide in the shadow and send a missive that could be softened? Langley swallowed. He hesitated, then added, because I hoped he would see the reason, not the threat. I thought the tension would make him act. I did not wish to appear begging. Poirot inclined his head. One who wishes to influence without revealing desperation. That is a delicate matter. And the groundskeeper, do you know him well enough that he would recognize your figure? Could he have mistaken another for you in the heat of observation? The mind, when it wishes to see certainty, does not always give clarity. I have seen him before, Langley said. He would know me. Grady, not content to wait for subtleties, clapped his notebook closed. Then the evidence is clear enough, he declared. The telegram shows motive and threat. The witness places you in position. Your agitation shows guilt. You will remain until we have spoken further. Langley's face crumpled slightly. You are making a mistake, he said, and in the softness of his voice was a crack of genuine confusion, not theatrically crafted innocence. Poirot, with a slight lift of one brow, did not oppose the holding of Langley. Inspector, he murmured in a tone that was almost conspiratorial, you have a fine tapestry, but I beg you, do not tie the knot too soon. The thread of this picture is not yet clear. There is something in the telegram, the manner of its composition, the heat behind it, that tells me it was written in haste to frighten, not to kill. And the groundskeeper's eye. He is a kind man, but has he been influenced by the nerves of the day? The impression of predatory focus. One can see such focus when one is worried that one will be accused. I ask only for balance. Hold your conclusion lightly. Grady, in his earnestness, was reluctant to let go. Monsieur Poirot, you are the one who said the carriage was a stage. This is the first act played out. If Monsieur Langley did not kill Sir Reginald, then someone has used his tension as cover. That is a more complicated thread. Precisely. Poirot's voice was calm. Complication, mon ami, is not to be feared. It is to be understood. Then, turning his attention to the others, he allowed the weight of the moment to settle in their minds. You have heard, oui. Messieurs et mesdames, there is an apparent lead. We shall follow it, but we shall not forget the little things that do not yet fit. The truth does not like to be hurried. The room shifted. Langley was escorted, politely, but with firm hands, to a small study where he would be kept until further questions. The air around the rest tightened, for the first time separating those who had been merely under suspicion from the one now contained. Later, alone with me under the awning, Poirot tapped the telegram delicately with the tip of his cane. The handwriting, he murmured, is too angular for the man who wrote the softened version. The smudge, see here, he pointed with a minute movement, is not from haste alone. It is from someone who expected the ink to dry and did not wait. The groundskeeper's observation is sincere, perhaps, but his certainty is too quick. The first false lead is like a curtain. Behind it, something else moves. We will watch, Hastings. We let the show think it has advanced. That is when the truth becomes impatient. Chapter 7. The psychological game. The arrest of Mr. Langley, though polite and temporary, had spread like a scent through the company. Some smelled relief, others suspicion sharpened. Poirot, however, had no interest in the satisfaction of the obvious. He saw the moment as fertile ground. The mind that believed itself cleared by the removal of one possibility becomes careless, and carelessness leaves behind the smallest trace. He began to play. not with cruelty, but with a deliberate artistry, setting small verbal snares and watching which ones twitched. He called first upon Lady Dressford, asking her to join him for a walk along the gravel path near the old yew. The sun had bent toward the western terrace, and in that light the shadows were soft, easy to blend with truth or disguise. Poirot did not begin by accusing. He remarked on her appearance, on the way her gloves fit, on the faint crease at the corner of her mouth when she smiled. "Madame," he said, "you told us that Sir Reginald spoke of loyalties shifting. Loyalty," he continued lightly, "is an interesting thing. One can hold it like a jewel, or wear it like a mask. You have many masks, not? Some that please, some that protect. When a man speaks of those who would stand with him, he is fishing for certainty. Did you perhaps offer him certainty, by way of suggestion, or by way of warning?" Her hand tightened around the fan. "I advised him to be clear," she answered calmly. "That is what any prudent friend would do. He trusted me to see patterns. I did not push. I only asked him to see what others might hide." Her eyes, however, flickered ever so faintly toward the hedge, where the carriage still rested like a silent question. Poirot nodded, and in that nod there was no judgment, only the slow placement of a piece. Patterns can be comforting and dangerous. "You speak of others hiding. Perhaps you, madame, have seen a thing clearly, and you wished him to see it as well. One does not warn without a reason." "Merci." Next, he sought out Mrs. Penelope Stratton. He found her in the small conservatory, fingers drumming a soft rhythm against the porcelain rim of a teacup. He sat opposite her without preamble. "Madame Stratton," Poirot said with a pleasant tilt, "you have been advising on phrasing. Words are like weapons, yes? One chooses them to protect or to wound. Sir Reginald was about to make a declaration, yes? One that would change balances. You, perhaps, were helping him shape it. Or were you shaping the reaction to it? The difference is subtle, mais très important." She smiled, slow and measured. "I have always believed that careful words can prevent calamity. He was indecisive, and I merely helped him see that clarity would reduce confusion. If that is shaping reaction, then so be it. But I did not intend to place a blade. He was the one who held the pen." "Ah," Poirot murmured, tapping the side of his nose faintly. "And yet a man who contemplates a blade might glance toward the hand that offers it. He might also glance toward the one who places the scabbard in his sight. You are very calm, madame. Calmness can be a harbor, or a place where the tide hides something beneath." She held his gaze without flinching. "I have seen men panic over less. Calmness helps me think. It may terrify others more than action." There was a pause, and the silence filled like a held breath. Poirot allowed the pause to settle, then withdrew with a soft merci. He had not pressed her further. He had instead placed a subtle seed, that her influence might have been more than benign. The psychological game progressed through small interactions. He visited Reverend Chalice, not with questions about charity luncheons now, but with the gentle probing of conscience. "Reverend," he said, "you described for us the elegance of Sir Reginald's language about trust built on shifting sands. The man who speaks in parables sometimes hides behind them. Do you find it easier to speak in stories than to look directly at the eyes of those who need hearing?" Chalice shifted uneasily. I try to soften truth for understanding," he stammered. "But yes, perhaps I have softened too much. Sir Reginald was a man who enjoyed paradox. It made him feel intelligent to hold the contradiction. I have. perhaps, been too careful in my own speech. It is hard to know when one is obscuring rather than revealing. And when one is obscuring, Poirot said quietly, the listener often sees what he wants to see. That is how a confessor becomes an accomplice without knowing. He let the implication hang a little longer, letting Chalice's discomfort show him the weight of ambiguity. The game was not limited to direct conversation. Poirot allowed subtle rumors to drift, not untrue, but incomplete, engineered to stir reactions. He made a remark, casually loud enough to carry, about the nature of reflection and perception, mentioning, to a small circle, that sometimes the brightest eyes are those that look away first. Lady Dressford's brow furrowed for a moment. Mrs. Stratton's fingers paused in their drumming. The smallest of shifts, the ones that would seem to others like chance, gave him insight into who felt touched by implication. Meanwhile, news of Langley's detention spread. He was not yet accused fully in the way the local papers might have phrased it, but the idea of a guilty man had settled like dust on the rafters. Poirot took the opportunity to bring Langley's tension back into the light by allowing a servant, carefully instructed, to mention within earshot of others the young man's earlier anxieties and his fear that he was being watched. The purpose was not to vilify. It was to observe what others would do with that thought. Colonel Finch's jaw tightened noticeably. Lady Dressford's lips compressed, and Madame Duval's expression, always a mask, softened incrementally, as if understanding something that had been troublesome before. A key figure, Lady Dressford began, under the weight of subtle implication, to show a crack. In a small moment when Poirot engaged her again, this time in the library near the portrait of the Manor's founder, her composure flickered. "You speak often of clarity," Poirot observed, "yet you guard your own intentions with care. If Sir Reginald had planned to expose something, you would have known. If he had planned to shift alliances, you would have felt it. You are not only aware of others' movements, madame. You are a mover. Do you find the idea of being moved without knowing it unpleasant?" Her smile returned, but thinner. "I prefer to choose my movements, Monsieur Poirot. I have no wish to be surprised." Her gaze, however, was drawn, briefly, to the portrait's eyes, as if seeking their counsel. Poirot's little gray cells, working like a quiet machine, registered all. He did not accuse, he did not congratulate. He waited, letting the psychological pressure accumulate where it could. The game had begun in earnest. The players, some knowing and some merely feeling, were adjusting their pieces. And beneath the surface, like a slight tremor before a larger motion, someone, was beginning to feel the tightening of the net, yet still held back from the confession that might break the carefully balanced illusion. Chapter 8. A secondary mystery. The tension, like a taut string, had not yet snapped, and the company at St. Aubin was beginning to feel the small vibrations of unease in every polite smile. Poirot, whose little gray cells had been gathering echoes and reflections, allowed the current to settle for a breath, only to be interrupted by something that altered its direction entirely. It was Evelyn Marsden who brought it to him, her sketchbook clutched close, her face drawn with the concentration of one who has seen a thing that does not fit the pattern previously assumed. She found us in the conservatory, a place of ferns and framed sunlight, and her voice, though calm, carried a quickness that marked unease. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, "there is something missing. I was going over the sketches I made earlier, faces, angles, the carriage and its reflections, and I realized that the envelope from Sir Reginald's satchel is gone." Poirot's eyes, which had been soft as a resting cat's, sharpened. "Gone? You mean the broken sealed envelope we saw in his satchel, the one with the smear and the silk thread?" She nodded. "I asked when we brought the satchel to the library. It was there. I saw you place it in your pocket." Her glance flicked to me, and later, when you were speaking with others, it was gone. I assumed you had set it aside. I must have mistaken. I went back. Inspector Grady permitted me to look, and the packet is not there. The satchel is undisturbed otherwise. Nothing else is missing." Poirot's mustaches twitched just slightly. "The little things, mademoiselle. They speak when the large ones are quiet." "Thank you." He turned to me. "Hastings, we have another movement. A disappearance within the disappearance. We must keep this small, not to alarm beyond necessity, but to see who, when the knowledge of absence spreads, reacts as if it had weight." He called in Grady at once. The inspector, who had been given a measure of satisfaction at the supposed advancement with Langley, frowned at the new complication. "You mean to say something was taken from the dead man's belongings while we had control?" "It appears so," Poirot replied, "but not in the manner of a robber, no. The envelope was private. It was broken and yet kept. The removal is subtle. We do not shout theft. We whisper question. Who would wish the contents hidden further, and from whom?" The small group reconvened beneath the high arch of the portico. Lady Dresford's face held the careful neutrality of a woman watching the wind's direction. Colonel Finch's fingers drummed a quiet rhythm against the banister. Mrs. Stratton had arrived, and her expression suggested both curiosity and the measured control of someone accustomed to recalibrating when the ground shifted beneath her. "Someone has taken something from Sir Reginald's satchel," Poirot said plainly. "An envelope, broken, marked with a seal now in pieces, with a hidden thread of silk. It was observed by Miss Marsden. Later, when the satchel was examined, the envelope was gone. It is not the work of a common thief. It is the work of someone who believes that the absence will not be noticed, until it is, yes? Who among you has had the opportunity to handle the satchel when others' attention was elsewhere?" A flurry of defensive postures rose, some slight, some more guarded. Lady Dresford's gloves tightened minutely. Colonel Finch's eyes, which had been distant, flickered toward Mrs. Stratton. Mrs. Stratton's smile barely shifted, but her right hand, resting on the banister, curled just perceptibly. "I was near the library," she said smoothly. "Sir Reginald's papers have always interested me. His phrasing, his intention. I may have touched the satchel when I passed, to see if any of the wording had been left in draft. I would not have taken anything. I would not have been so crude." Poirot's head tilted. "Touching is a habit of the curious. Taking is a different dance. Colonel Finch, you were in the vicinity. You have commented on shifting loyalties. Did you happen to see anything removed?" "I saw no one," Finch said. "I watched those who came and left. There was a moment when Mrs. Stratton was near, and Miss Marsden was called away, but I saw nothing of consequence." Lady Dresford, with a cool glance, added, "I went to speak with the vicar. I remained there. If anything was taken, it was not in my presence." Reverend Chalice, who had been quiet since the earlier probing, stepped forward with a discomfort that was no longer vocal but visible. "I passed the library a little while after the first examination. I saw Miss Marsden there. I also saw, I thought I saw a flutter of paper near the armchair, something, perhaps, dropped by Sir Reginald earlier. I did not think it to be of import." I did not see anything taken. Poirot's gaze, which had been sweeping, settled on a small detail, a faint scent of lilac near Mrs. Stratton, where no flowers had been placed, and a thin crease in the upholstery of the library chair as if someone had leaned back with the weight of hesitation. He said nothing of these now. He raised one finger, not in accusation, but in quiet collection. "We shall expand," he murmured to me. "The secondary mystery is not the letter alone. It is the assumption that secrecy was enough once the envelope was broken. Someone took it to prevent its contents from being seen again. That means its message matters, perhaps more than we suspected. We keep the knowledge between us for now. We will track movement of those who had reason to remove it." Then, louder, "To the small assembly, I ask that the satchel remain untouched, and that none of you speak of the envelope's removal beyond this circle. The truth, mes amis, tolerates secrecy when it is used to expose, not protect." The small circle dispersed, but like scent in the air, the tension remained. In the corridor, I saw Mr. Langley watching from the doorway of the study where he was held, not with guilt, but with a curious doubt, as if the shifting of suspicion had reopened a door he had thought closed. Madame Duval, standing near the conservatory window, watched with the look of one who observes a new pattern emerging, and knows that in the interplay of these patterns the real image, still blurred, begins to take sharper shape. Poirot led me to the small writing room, and once inside, he allowed the corners of his mouth to lift, not in triumph, but in the soft recognition of movement. "The first false lead," he murmured, "gave them comfort. The disappearance," he tapped the envelope's absence with the tip of his cane in the air, "gives them unease. People act when comfort becomes uncertain. That is when the real actor will perhaps attempt to correct a mistake. We sit, Hastings. We let the pieces think they know too much. Then we provoke the one who hides to reveal, not by force, but by the fear of losing control." Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The secondary mystery, the missing envelope, had shifted the atmosphere at St. Aubin, where certainty had begun to edge into complacency. Now an unsettled awareness threaded itself through every polite conversation. Poirot, who had allowed the false lead and the theft to ripple through the company, now turned his attention toward weaving the obvious and the subtle into a network, seeking how the lives and motives of the suspects intersected in corners where they claimed independence. He began with two who had appeared separate: Mrs. Penelope Stratton and Colonel Finch. The colonel, who had insisted on business disagreements and shifting loyalties, was found in quiet conversation with Mrs. Stratton near the greenhouse. They spoke less of Sir Reginald directly, and more in elliptical references, the kind that admitted nothing directly but, in tone and shared glance, suggested familiarity beyond mere acquaintance. Poirot, standing a step behind as if by accident, watched them exchange a small, folded scrap of paper. Mrs. Stratton's hand hovered just a second longer than necessary before withdrawing, and Finch, with the stiff reserve he cultivated, nodded minutely, a movement that implied a shared decision. Later, when Poirot drew me aside in the library, he whispered, "The paper. It is not yet important what it reads. The gesture tells us they coordinate." The colonel's comment about shifting loyalties and Mrs. Stratton's subtle correction of wording, these are not independent. They are two voices harmonizing a single theme. We must find the origin of that melody. He followed that thread to Reverend Chalice. The vicar had, earlier, seemed a gentle observer of people's moral inconsistencies, but now Poirot had him in a quiet corner of the drawing-room, where he was admitting, without seeming to, with a softness that betrayed discomfort, that he had been approached by Mrs. Stratton to give a blessing to a planned donation, one phrased in a particular legally ambiguous manner. She wished to ensure, Chalice confessed in the way of a man who mislaid intention for influence, that the wording would please both conscience and public expectation. She said it would help stabilize what might otherwise seem uncertain. Stabilize, Poirot echoed softly, a word that offers comfort and the illusion of control. Madame Stratton is adjusting the frame around something that might otherwise be sharp. Reverend, you provided the light that made the adjustment respectable. Connections, Hastings, they are not always of blood, but of convenience. She needed your blessing, you wanted to help, and in the center sits Sir Reginald, deciding who will hold his legacy. The circle widens. From there, Poirot moved like a quiet river, seeking tributaries. He asked Lady Dresford with his gentle insistence about her own ties to Mrs. Stratton. They had appeared cordial, even close in earlier exchanges, and Lady Dresford, in a moment of unguarded pretense, revealed her private concern. Mrs. Stratton had, weeks ago, suggested a public alignment of their philanthropic projects. She said, Lady Dresford admitted, that a shared venture would lend weight to both our names and provide a foundation for influence. I thought it a useful alliance. Perhaps she wished it less for charity than for placement. That placement, Poirot commented afterward to me, is something which feels like giving and taking at once. Partnerships of public generosity often serve secretly to shift private advantage. Lady Dresford's desire to appear above the fray is softened by her impulse to move it. Miss Evelyn Marsden, whose art had drawn faces into lines and shadings, now revealed a different pattern. Her sketches, which she had kept private for the most part, held more than expression. In the margin of a study of Sir Reginald's profile was a small, nearly hidden caricature of Mr. Langley conversing with a nameless figure, only the edge of a hat and a slight fraction of a face visible. Beside it, in a different pen, was a note in her own careful hand. He is not alone in the worry. Someone feeds him the concern. When Poirot questioned her, she clarified that Langley had visited her studio to discuss a design, but during that meeting a third person had arrived and departed without being introduced. A slender man with a nervous tic in his left hand, whose presence Langley acknowledged with a stiff courtesy and then hurried away. Poirot's interest deepened. The third presence, he murmured, the one who moves like a shadow with a habit, perhaps the one who places concern where it becomes urgency, the feed of worry, the injection of fear. Langley may have been pawnsome. The hand behind him is more useful. The actress, Madame Duval, who had been watching with a more detached curiosity, also disclosed a link she had observed between Lady Dresford and Reverend Chalice. In a gathering the night before, one not previously mentioned, Lady Dresford had quietly asked the vicar to soften the phrasing of a public statement about Sir Reginald's upcoming support for a cultural fund. She wanted it to suggest gratitude without obligation. Madame Duval noted, as if Sir Reginald were giving freely, though the undertone was something like warning, that the next favor must align with her terms. That exchange, combined with the earlier revelation of the alignment between Stratton and Finch, painted a lattice of influence, each strand touching and reinforcing the other. Poirot, having gathered these interwoven motives and alliances, did not yet speak them aloud. He was not ready to show the pattern in full. He wanted to see how the subjects would move within it. He smiled faintly at me. They think their secrets are separate. The true trick is to let them think that while the web tightens of its own accord, the connections will reveal their own pressure points. We do not pull yet. We watch who, when pressed by uncertainty, reaches for whom. The subtlety of the hidden connections was not mere gossip. Each relationship provided a way to influence or redirect perception, who supported donation phrasing, who aligned public postures, who whispered worry into eager ears. Beneath the politeness of the gathering, an architecture of dependence and leverage had formed, and Poirot, with the patience of the architect, now stood before it, not criticizing the builders, but understanding their design. In the moment before he moved to the next phase, he turned to me with a quiet pronouncement. Almost to himself, "This is not a single crime, Hastings. It is a constellation. The murder occurred in one place, but the stars that govern its shape are dispersed. We shall find the brightest ones. They will cast the longest shadows." Chapter 10. Poirot's Secret Clue. The web that Poirot had allowed to form was intricate, and yet, like a tapestry viewed from one side, the design remained opaque to all but the weaver. He had observed alliances, nuanced influences, and anxieties fed by unseen hands. Now, in the quiet interval between the afternoon's murmurs and the approaching evening, Poirot held in his mind a small piece that others had overlooked, a tiny, secret hinge upon which the whole elaborate mechanism might turn. He did not speak of it immediately. He let it live, soft and latent, while he arranged the manner of its use. We were in the study, the room where Langley was being held under gentle guard, when Poirot asked me to bring him the broken seal from Sir Reginald's satchel. The small glassine packet had, under his direction, been recovered from where he had placed it, and preserved with a cautious reverence. The seal itself, done in wax and bearing the pattern of the crowned lion, was cracked, its halves slightly separated, a thin smear of dark residue still clinging in one fissure. The silk thread, once attached, had been noted earlier and disappeared, but the broken envelope's edges held a whisper of its former presence. Poirot turned the seal ever so slightly, his tiny fingers barely touching its edges. He did not look like a man who held a revelation. He looked rather like a man examining a surface for dust. Then, with the refined attention of a jeweler, he tapped the wax with the tip of his cane. "Hastings," he said softly, "we have been listening to voices. Now we listen to the silence between them." He lifted the seal with care and blew upon it, not to remove anything, but to observe the way the residue responded. The small fragment of dried substance, which could have been dismissed as nothing more than old wax blended with the ambient dust of a garden house, shifted slightly, just enough for the corner of the crack to catch the light differently. Poirot's mouth softened in the shadow of thought. "See here," he whispered, and he drew from his pocket a small magnifying glass, the handle worn from years of use. Under its lens, the smear resolved not merely a shadow of wax and dust, but a trace of a fine, faint powder intermingled, something like the dust of a certain rare imported pigment, a blue so deep it had been used in the past for the lining of very private correspondence. The careful reader might have seen it as residue from a previous sealing, but Poirot's eyes, after having seen so many subtle lies, saw that the powder was not random. It had been placed, almost invisibly, in the cracked part of the seal, invisible to the ordinary, he murmured. "The little detail, Hastings, is this. The seal was broken earlier, before the carriage demonstration. The envelope was resealed with haste, not with the intention of hiding its existence, but to delay discovery of its contents. The powder, this blue, was used to mask another odor, perhaps, or to signify something between co-conspirators. But the true secret is in the break itself. The edges, look. He held it so the light caught the tiny irregularities. One side is worn slightly differently. The impression was not made with the same pressure. That tells me 2 people have handled it differently. One broke it. Another, later, forced the 2 parts together again without smoothing them. It is the difference between intention and correction. I nodded slowly. So someone saw it broken, and then someone else tried to hide the fact it had been reopened. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, mon ami, the person who resealed wished to keep the knowledge from those who might read it prematurely, yet did not have the authority, or perhaps the desire, to destroy it. That is interesting. It means the content mattered, but its immediate revelation did not. The one who broke it first, he or she had urgency. The one who patched it, caution. They are different minds, and between them the true information waited. Perhaps still within reach. He placed the seal gently on the desk. "We have a stratagem," he said. "The one who resealed believes the matter delayed. The one who broke it believes it hidden. Both have assumed the other's work sufficient. We will not confront either yet. We will use their assumptions." He looked at the small group of papers lying nearby. Sir Reginald's drafts, the mixture of phrasing suggested by Mrs. Stratton, the notes of Reverend Chalice, and the quiet margin doodles of Miss Marsden. We will allow the first false lead to persist a while longer. It keeps the heat away. The stolen envelope's absence gives the perpetrator a sense of control. But the secret is this. The one who corrected the break will want reassurance that the content remains unread. The one who broke it will wish to know if concealment has worked. They will act. They will check. They will communicate. In that checking and communicating, he tapped his temple lightly. They expose themselves. He drew a small plan on a scrap of paper, assigning soft, unnamed roles to the players. We will watch who asks questions about the envelope without naming it. We will see who seeks the opinion of the other, directly or through suggestion, regarding whether a thing has been seen. We shall let the tension between urgency and caution turn into a conversation. One will reassure, the other will probe. The true clue will surface not from a confession, but from the way they attempt to manage each other's fear. He folded the scrap, placed it in his coat, and turned to the window. The light was thinning, and the shade across the garden was growing long. "Now," he added quietly to me, "we set the stage. We let the players believe they have hidden the small thing. They have not. We will give them time to show us how they attempt to shield it. Then, when the moment is right, the secret will come to us not as theft, but as a breath too deep in a calm room." Chapter 11. Tensions Rise. The evening brought a lowering of light and a heightening of unease. The web Poirot had allowed to grow now vibrated with restless energy. Underneath the genteel facades, alliances strained, suspicions wound tighter, and the carefully measured masks began to show tiny fissures, as those caught between strategy and fear tried, subtly, to reposition themselves. Poirot watched, not with impatience, but with the quiet certainty of one who knows a storm is gathering and is noting the way the leaves begin to twist before the wind arrives. The first fracture appeared, not with a blaze, but with a small, sharp comment between Lady Dressford and Mrs. Stratton. They had been seen together in the music room, exchanging what had looked earlier like a friendly alignment of philanthropic plans. Now their conversation had the edge of covert rivalry. Lady Dressford, with her voice just above the level of ordinary politeness, referred to Sir Reginald's sudden reconsiderations, and the need for those around him to remain transparent in intention. Mrs. Stratton, with a faint smile, replied that transparency was admirable when one's motives were pure, but that clarity without context could be used as accusation by those who sought to impose their own order. "You have been advising him on phrasing." Lady Dressford said, the words soft, precise. "Perhaps it is easier to shape public opinion when one controls the narrative before the fact." "And perhaps," Mrs. Stratton returned, "it is more difficult to hold sway afterward when others presume they see shadows instead of substance. The narrative is not made of words only, madame. It is made of trust. That trust shifts, as you know." Her glance flicked ever so briefly toward Reverend Chalice, who had entered with an air of unnecessary hesitation. The vicar stopped, sensing the tension, and then, with a courteous clearance of throat, excused himself. Poirot, from his position near the doorway, allowed the exchange to settle, like a powder puff's soft impact. He did not intervene, but he made a small note, not in a book, which he did not carry, but in the flicker of his expression and the small tightening of his hand. The two women had been aligned. Now, under pressure, they were subtly retracting, each placing a little blame under the guise of concern for propriety. The shifting to Poirot was more revealing than any direct accusation. The strain between Colonel Finch and Mrs. Stratton, too, deepened. The scrap of paper I had seen earlier, handed from one to the other in a movement that might have been casual, had in the afternoon become a point of silent contest. Finch, who had maintained a stiff neutrality, now talked in half-sentences about loyalty that requires active tending, and the necessity of protecting oneself from the consequences of too much candor. Mrs. Stratton, when approached by Poirot in the hallway, offered the same measured calm she always did, but her fingers betrayed her, a slight tremor when she refolded the napkin at the coffee table. Poirot, as if not noticing, spoke of the difficulty of balancing transparency and influence, and she answered that the balance was a daily discipline. The air around Mr. Langley had become more volatile. Held in the small study, his composure cracked intermittently under the pressure of being the apparent culprit and of watching others subtly shift as though testing whether the spotlight had moved. He had received anonymously a small folded note slipped under the door during the late afternoon, a brief message composed of a few words in a hand that suggested urgency. "Be calm. The first fracture will distract. Do not speak of the envelope. Trust the silence." Langley's hands shook slightly when he showed it to Poirot, who had requested to see all communications, quietly, without dramatizing the gesture. "Who sent this?" I asked. Langley looked away. "I do not know. I have enemies enough to imagine half the town would wish me uneasy. But this one comes from someone who knows the game is shifting. They want me to hold. They also want me to feel I am at the center. I do not know if it is help or manipulation." Poirot took the note between his fingers and smoothed it without comment. "The one who sent this," he said finally, "wants you to believe in the distraction of others. That, mon ami, is a form of direction. They do not wish you to look too closely at something, perhaps the very thing that is hidden and yet not gone. Do not speak of the envelope. That is their instruction. They are afraid someone else has looked already. They assume you could be a leak. The fear is useful. The assumption is a weakness. We watch who tries to shore the leak and who, behind the shore, looks for the next droplet. Langley's eyes darted to the door, then lowered. They are all looking, Monsieur Poirot. I can feel it. I do not know whom to trust. That is the most dangerous thing. It is always the most dangerous thing. Poirot agreed. When one is isolated by suspicion, one begins to see enemies even under kind faces. He left Langley with the soft assurance that the young man's detention would continue, but with a note that the original threat might have value beyond its apparent malice. The tension also found its way to Reverend Chalice. He was cornered, in a manner of speaking, by Madame Duval, who, with her artful neutrality, lifted the veil of his earlier guarded phrasing. "You soften everything," she told him, in that low voice of hers. "For whom do you soften the truth? For those who would shape it, or for those who would be spared its weight?" He stammered, trying to find a middle ground, and in doing so, revealed not only the influence Mrs. Stratton had had in his earlier counsel, but also a hesitation that suggested he had already begun to doubt his own role in shaping the messages of others. Through all this, Poirot observed the small reversals: Lady Dresford slipping into private speculation with Colonel Finch, Mrs. Stratton's calm veneer thinning when the conversation turned to the nature of control, Langley's certainty bending under the idea that his tension had been engineered rather than genuine, Reverend Chalice's discomfort growing as the implication of his softening became a tool in other hands. The connections he had mapped earlier now experienced pressure at the joints. Some held, others, quietly, shifted their weight to avoid rupture. Poirot turned to me then, when the moment allowed. They have begun to use each other's anxiety as a screen. That is good. When a man tries to hide his own fear by pointing to another's, he shows us where the real worry lies. The tension is the sound before the snap. We listen. The one who made the mistake, the one who has knowledge they should not, who will reach too quickly to steady themselves, will do so because they wish to bind another. We watch who reaches. Chapter 12. The confrontation. The evening deepened, and with it the pressure on those whose secrets were held together by careful breath. Poirot, who had been patient as the gathering storm, now chose to apply a very particular pressure, not loud, not accusatory, but the kind that makes a mind become aware of its own tremor. He had, in the secret of his little gray cells, seen the place where the threads converged most tightly. He would not strike blindly. He would prod softly and wait for the person beneath to flinch, not in denial, but in the revealing involuntary motion of someone who had been balancing too many weights. He had arranged it so that Mrs. Penelope Stratton and I would be alone in the library, ostensibly to discuss the phrasing of Sir Reginald's intended public statement. The oil lamp cast a warm, golden glow over the room, gilding the edges of books and making the shadows between them seem like curtains one might draw back. Mrs. Stratton sat, her posture composed, her hands resting calmly on the arms of the chair. Yet underlying that calm was a tautness Poirot had learned to read as keenly as the texture of a handwriting sample. Poirot began with something that seemed innocuous. "Madame," he said, "you are a woman who understands the power of a word placed well. You advised Sir Reginald, oui? You suggested, perhaps, that clarity could be a shield. Yet there is a difference between advising and preparing the shield for the one who does not know the direction of the blow. You have been careful. Very careful. But I wonder, does carefulness tire the hands that hold it? When one is careful, one notices the small undoing of another's care. You saw the envelope. You saw it broken. You saw it mended. That is not common knowledge. Tell me, was it the mending that gave you pause, or the breaking? Mrs. Stratton's lid-like eyes blinked once, with the smooth economy of someone who had rehearsed calm. Monsieur Poirot, she replied lightly, I do not know of what you speak in terms of mending. There was an envelope, yes. Broken, perhaps. One cannot keep all the details of grief in the mind without them blending. I am concerned, as we all are, about how the idea of exposure will warp the narrative. Her fingers tapped the armrest, a rhythm so measured it might have been mistaken by others for composure. Poirot tilted his head slightly, letting the silence sit a moment longer than the comfort of conversation would allow. Ah, yes, grief does that. It makes things muddy unless one distinguishes. The one who mended, he allowed the word to linger, did so with the intention to delay revelation, not to destroy. That is the subtle thing. One who breaks and one who corrects act differently. The seam shows the haste of correction. You would know, madame, that there is a difference in pressure. One is a blunt force, the other a smoothing that leaves a fingerprint. Some might say the one who did the mending was gentle. Others would say the mender feared the broken thing would be seen too soon. Her smile, previously quick to settle back into placid elegance, fluttered just barely, like a curtain stirred from inside. You are weaving metaphors, Monsieur Poirot, to make simple things seem complex. I am here because I wished Sir Reginald to present himself without confusion. That is all. People take a desire for clarity and turn it into a tale of conspiracy. The broken, whatever it was of no consequence. He chooses what to reveal. He chooses with whom to align. I only helped him shape it for the public. Poirot's eyes, small and precise, did not move from her face. You helped him shape the public, yes. You also sought influence over the private. You wanted to steady the frame before the picture was hung. That requires knowing what is hidden behind the canvas, does it not? If a thing is hidden and you wish to make the frame strong, you must know its edges. You have a concern for what is seen and for what is kept from eyes that would take advantage. That is not merely generosity. He leaned forward, the light catching the slight glisten at the corner of Mrs. Stratton's mouth. You knew the envelope had been taken, oui? Not only that, you knew its absence would cause unease, and you also knew, here, he tapped lightly on the arm of the chair, that someone had gone further to hide not only its absence, but its alteration. The mending was done with care so that one might believe it was whole, and yet you referenced only the broken, not the seamless repair. Why mention the break unless you had seen the attempt to hide that the content was still there? Deferred? You are protecting a process, madame, and not merely a phrasing. For a beat, the room held. Mrs. Stratton's calm showed a hairline fissure. The smallest quickening of breath, a fraction of an eyelid's twitch. She adjusted the slight angle of her hand. And, for the first time, the napkin at her lap shifted, revealing a crease that had not been there before, as if she had clutched and released too fast. Monsieur Poirot, she said, voice just a shade sharper, I have no duty to explain tragedies to you. I suggested wording. I did not manage secrets. If someone wished to keep something hidden, that was their affair. You make it sound as if I sat with a needle in the dark, stitching truth to suit myself. I am not a seamstress of lies. Poirot's smile was faint, not unkind. No, madame, you are a steward of perception. There is a difference." He paused, then softened further, not in concession but in enticement. "You have influence over those who speak. You also have an ally who tends loyalty like a garden, Colonel Finch. He shares your care for what is visible, yes. He also shares your knowledge of who might cut the root if not watched. The mending was done by someone who feared the breaking would be seen. The breaking was done by someone who sought urgency. You know both because you knit the frames. You are managing the anxiety between them. That is why you spoke of wording, and that is why you mentioned the broken without the repaired. You feared a revelation, not of the content, but of the awareness that it had been consciously delayed." She straightened with a snap, and for a moment her poised mask hardened into something brittle. "You are clever, Monsieur Poirot, perhaps too clever. You see in every adjustment a confession. I will admit this. I wished to keep the state of the matter from becoming a spectacle. I did not want Sir Reginald's private intention dragged like a curtain before the crowd. That does not mean I tampered with the truth of its contents. The repair you speak of, if there was one, was done because someone panicked. That is all." Poirot leaned back, his expression unchanging, but the small gleam in his eye showed the shift, a trembling, slight, that Mrs. Stratton had made. "Panic," he repeated softly. "Yes, panic and the need to control its aftermath. We shall see, madam, who comforts the panicked and who instructs them to wait. They will speak to you. They will seek your sanction. In doing so, they show their own fear. The one who reaches to you first when the silence grows too loud is the one who broke. The one who softens that reach is the one who mended." She lowered her gaze, the smallest hesitation appearing before she lifted it again with measured grace. "You will not find what you seek in my confession, Monsieur Poirot. I only speak of intention, not act." "And intention," he said, with a lightness that had no weight to the untrained ear, "is the first place where truth catches breath before it moves." He rose, and with that the confrontation ended, not in an explosion, but in the quiet placement of a piece. Mrs. Stratton remained sitting, her hands still, her calm now edged with a new vigilance. Poirot, meanwhile, walked to the window, and in the reflection he saw her watching him, precise and watchful, a woman who knew a line had been drawn, and who would now test its depth. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape night had fallen over St. Aubin, wrapping the estate in a velvet quiet that made every footstep sound heavier, as if the darkness itself were listening. The confrontation with Mrs. Stratton had settled like a stone in the pool, its ripples slow but insistent. Poirot, having placed his questions like seeds in fertile soil, now waited to see which would sprout in panic and which would be watered with calculation. What he did not expect, though he was always prepared, was the sudden, violent movement from someone who believed the tightening web had become a trap. It was Miss Evelyn Marsden who noticed first. She came to me in the corridor just after the midnight chimes from the small estate clock, her breath shallow, her eyes wide with the sort of alarm that comes when one sees a familiar line distorted beyond recognition. "Captain Hastings," she whispered, "someone has been in the study. I saw the door, just now, slightly ajar. There was a shadow, a movement. I thought it might be the wind. Then I saw the corner of something, white, slip under the desk. It moved toward the door, quick, like a cat escaping. I followed. I heard a noise in the library, a drawer closing too hurriedly. I did not disturb. I came to you because I thought perhaps you—" "Poirot," I said, and we hurried. The study's door, which had been kept locked for Langley's questioning, was indeed slightly open. Inside, the small light from the shaded lamp had been dimmed. The shade was crooked, and the chair in front of the desk had been pulled back as if someone had left abruptly. On the floor, half hidden beneath the edge of the Persian rug, was a slim scrap of paper, torn, damp, with a faint trace of perfume not belonging to the room's usual scents. The desk drawer that held the initial carefully preserved papers was slightly ajar, and the small glassine packet containing the broken seal had vanished. Poirot's face, ordinarily composed like a well-kept facade, changed in the subtlest of ways. The tiny muscle at the corner of his mouth tightened, not in surprise, but in the quiet acknowledgment that the game had shifted. "Hastings," he said, and his voice was calm, "the desperate one has moved. They believed the night would give them cover. They forget that the darkness also deepens the smallest footprints." Inspector Grady arrived, his pocket watch ticking as loudly in the silence as if it were a branded accusation. He found Poirot already kneeling, examining the slight depression in the rug's edge, then rising to survey the whole room with that meticulous gaze. "Someone has taken the seal," Grady announced, his tone mingling irritation with discomfort. "They could have come when the others were distracted by the dinner. The door was not forced." "No," Poirot replied softly. "Force is for those who have nothing to lose. This was a movement of haste and fear, a hand that knows the value of what was kept, and who fears its exposure. The one who took it believes time is pressing. They intend either to destroy the secret or to use it in a way that changes its frame." Langley, brought in under polite guard, looked at the scene with a pale, tightened face. "I did not—" His sentence hung, unfinished, because in that room the silence had already formed a hypothesis. He was quiet, but his eyes flicked not toward the missing seal alone, but toward the scrap of perfume-dampened paper. "Who was here?" he asked, with a tremor in his voice that betrayed both fear and the instinct to avoid seeming too eager. Poirot stood, straightened his coat, and walked slowly to the small piece of paper by the rug. He lifted it with the tip of his cane and held it near the lamp's light. On its surface were several faint impressions, like the ghost of writing, and the corner carried the residue of a different scent, a delicate floral note mingled with something sharper, the trace of a rare imported cologne that Madame Duval favored for performances when she wished to suggest presence without revealing intention. Poirot did not reveal that observation yet. Instead, he turned to the others. "Someone came," Poirot said, "not to speak. They came to take. They knew the value of the seal's silence and feared its revelation. The scrap of paper was dropped in a hurry. The scent was transferred by accident. An opening, a movement near the door. A breath too deep when one thought no one listened. We have a desperate attempt, yes. Now we watch whom desperation makes careless." Mrs. Stratton appeared at the doorway, having been roused by the noise, her face unreadable in the dim light. "What is the matter?" she asked, without surprise, as if this turn were a possibility she had considered and accepted. "The seal is taken," Poirot said simply. "The person who broke and then had it smoothed has had their secret threatened. They come to either reclaim control or erase it. That is the movement of the desperate." He looked at her, then, with precise stillness. "Who among you would believe that stealing the seal would remove the tension? Who would think its absence would silence the truth, instead of making it louder?" She did not answer immediately. Her lips pressed together and for a beat the tension around her eyes tightened. Then she said coolly, "When a secret is endangered, one protects it." Perhaps someone felt the necessity to keep it from being used, either by taking it or by preserving it. You think me implicated, because I have influence, Monsieur Poirot. You are correct to consider the possibility, but the desperation is not always from the one who loses. Sometimes it is from the one who believes loss is imminent. Poirot's eyes, small and calculating, regarded her without judgment. Yes, sometimes fear of losing control is itself the precipice. We shall see if the one who took the seal seeks help to remake the frame, or if they act alone in the dark, believing themselves the only hand that can decide. He turned toward Langley. "Monsieur Langley, you are held here. You had motive exposed, and now the object that was part of the puzzle has disappeared. That could be comforting or dangerous. Do you wish to speak of any movement you heard? Any shadow you believed to be nothing?" Langley swallowed. "I heard footsteps outside. Soft. I thought at first it was a servant checking, then a whisper, not distinct, and the air changed. I did not move. I did not want to seem obvious. The seal, it was here. I would not have taken it. I would not have known its value fully. I only know someone came in fear. The desperation felt like the one who is cornered, not the one who cornered." Poirot nodded. "The cornered sometimes appear with the boldness of those who would claim they are the hunter. That is why we watch. The one who is desperate enough to take the object that holds a secret will try to hide what they have done by making others believe they are the hunted. He had me accompany him from the room before the discussions grew louder. In the hall, he pressed his fingers together. 'They have moved too soon,' he said quietly. The one who stole the seal believed the first false lead, and the secondary concealment gave them enough cover. They were wrong. We now have a new pressure point. The person who tries to restore what was taken will show themselves. The one who tries to erase the original will act more wildly. We wait. The attempt to escape through theft has only made the true culprit more visible in their desperate correction." Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. The theft of the seal had rippled through the assembled company like a pebble dropped into a clear pond, rings spreading, some overlapping, some colliding, but the surface not yet broken. Poirot had expected movement. What he had not expected was how the desperation would serve to sharpen rather than obscure. The one who thought themselves clever by stealing had only drawn a brighter line around their own shadow. Now the evening was thinning, and the last piece, small, quiet, surprisingly ordinary, slid into place not from a confession, but from the way a single person, under pressure, misstepped. It began with a brief, almost casual remark from Reverend Chalice, made to Lady Dresford during a gathering in the drawing-room. They were discussing the upcoming charity lecture, a subject which had previously seemed remote from murder and missing seals, when the vicar, in a tone of innocent reflection, said, "It is curious, is it not, how people try to protect their intentions with layers of language. Some will even repair what is broken, and hope none will notice the seam. I have observed that the one who fears exposure most often speaks of clarity, while the one who has something to hide calls for patience." Lady Dresford's eyebrows lifted, and she replied guardedly about the problem of balancing candor and discretion. Poirot, who had been standing near the fireplace, listening with polite attention, allowed the conversation to ripple outward, the way one drops a trail of breadcrumbs and waits for the hunger to lead. Later, when the lights were lowered and the smaller clusters dissolved into quiet corners, Poirot drew me aside. "Hastings," he said, almost in a whisper, though there was no need for secrecy in his voice. "The vicar's remark was not accidental. He has been coached to speak of mending without naming the mender. That is what he thinks he is doing, offering a reflection on human behavior. He does not know he has placed the last tile in the mosaic." We went, as if by unspoken agreement, quietly to the small side parlor where Reverend Chalice sat, a book open but unread in his lap, his hands folded. He looked calm, too calm. Poirot approached with the soft, unassuming step of a man who has come to offer comfort, not to accuse. "Reverend," Poirot said pleasantly, "you speak of psalms and the one who covers them. It is a fine metaphor. You also offered Lady Dresford a notion that the one who calls for patience may be hiding. That is interesting, yes. Who taught you to frame it in that way? Who whispered to you that mending requires a look of clarity while the work goes on behind?" He paused, letting the question breathe, and Chalice's eyelids, which had been steady, flickered. Chalice began, but his voice, which often carried that soft parable, now had a tremor that betrayed an internal tug. Mrs. Stratton suggested we emphasize careful language. She said that if we spoke of the attempt to make things whole, people would accept delay as virtue rather than concealment. It was a way to keep the public calm. I only took her suggestion and framed it as an observation. Poirot's small smile was not sharp, but it carried the weight of understanding. "And the one who mended, did you speak to them about how to speak to others? Did you perhaps present the idea that the one who breaks will point to the one who delays, as if the delay were the deception? It is a clever reversal. The one who fears exposure teaches others to look at patience as a mask." Chalice's hands shifted. She feared the broken be seen before the prepared framing. She wanted the narrative to be steady. I only gave words to her concern. "And in doing so," Poirot said, "you showed us the seam. The one who instructs the caretaker of language to speak about mending, so that the mender can be seen as innocent. That one is near the hidden truth. You have placed a piece, Reverend. It was not your design. It was a direction. You have helped us understand the relationship between the one seeking to control perception and the one who holds the thread." He stepped back slightly. "Merci." We left him with the quietness of someone who believes he has done good, and yet whose own carefully placed intention had given away the nature of the hidden hand. Poirot's eyes, as we walked down the dim corridor, were alive with that contained excitement of one who had assembled in secret, the last necessary part. "The mender and the adviser," he whispered, "have been working together for influence. The vicar's language was seeded. The one who broke the seal feared exposure. The one who smoothed it feared spectacle. The one who advises the messenger to speak of patience while presenting the delay as virtue, she is protecting not the content, but the control over its revelation. Now we have the pressure point. They will want reassurance. They will seek out their confidants. In that seeking, they believe themselves clever. They will speak too much or too soon, and the real sequence will reveal itself." He paused, looking through the window into the garden, where the shadows had lengthened into soft black. In the distance, a maid passed with a tray, unaware that beneath the gentle calm, the final piece of the puzzle had settled like a quiet stone, making the pattern whole enough that only the subtle discrepancy remained to be exposed, an edge to be felt, not yet named. "We do not act tonight," Poirot concluded. "They think the net is not yet closing. We let the tension build one more breath. The one who controls the timing will think themselves in command. That is when they will slip. Chapter 15. The final gathering the next morning dawned with a brittle clarity. The air had that thin, sharp quality of a day in which decisions, not weather, would determine the temperature of the room. Poirot, who had slept little, if sleep can be said to visit one whose little gray cells continue their labor in the dark, was already at work when I found him standing by the breakfast table. His gaze not on the spread of delicate pastries, but on the way the light caught the edges of the morning papers. He had said the previous night that the time for waiting was nearly at an end. Now he acted with the quiet exactitude of a general assembling officers before revealing the battle plan. He sent for all of them, not with the ceremonial blare of accusation, but with the gentle, inevitable gravity of a host who has asked guests to sit in a particular order at a dinner, so that the conversation will flow as intended. The drawing-room was rearranged. Chairs were placed in a semicircle facing the fireplace, where a small table held a few items. The carved box from the carriage demonstration. The space that had once held Sir Reginald's papers, now carefully preserved under glass. And, subtly, the absence of something, an empty place that carried weight more than any object might have. Lady Dressford arrived, elegant as ever, yet the color in her cheeks was paler, and her smile had lost a fraction of ease. Colonel Finch followed, his posture tightened, his eyes flicking briefly to Mrs. Stratton, who entered with that calm control she had so carefully cultivated. Yet something in her held a new watchfulness. Her gloved hands rested lightly but deliberately on her lap. Reverend Chalice came next, carrying the air of the man who believes he is offering comfort, and yet his movements betrayed a new thoughtfulness, as if words now passed through a sieve before being released. Madame Duval was present, serene in her posed indifference, but her gaze, sharp, assessing, never missed the slight tremors of those around her. Miss Evelyn Marsden arrived carrying her sketchbook, her eyes bright, not with naive curiosity, but with the quiet knowing of someone who had seen too many overlapping patterns to be easily misled. Mr. Langley, still under polite constraint, followed with the tension of a man whose self-possession had been tested beyond his intention. Mrs. Stratton, last, completed the circle, her posture composed but not unassailable. The slight crease of vigilance at the corner of her mouth betrayed the knowledge that a line had been drawn. Inspector Grady stood near the mantel, notebook closed, looking both relieved and circumspect, the way one does when one is about to hear the completion of a story he had been observing from the periphery. Poirot, with a small, precise gesture, indicated for them to sit. He did not begin with the accusation. He began with atmosphere. "You have all," he said softly, "been very generous. You have given me impressions, suggestions, worries. That is a kindness. Now, we are all in a place of understanding, some more, some less. I ask only silence for a moment. There is a rhythm to truth. It is not loud like a drum. It is a small beat, and if listened for, one hears where the next movement will fall." He paused, letting the little silence settle. Then he took from a small envelope the piece of thin paper, Langley's anonymous note, and laid it flat on the table without comment. The eyes around him shifted, some with interest, some with the flicker of concern, but no one touched it. Poirot's gaze moved in the measured pattern of someone describing a landscape before revealing the path. "We have had," he continued, "a first false lead. That lead gave us comfort, a place to anchor the mind. We have had a secret removed, and with its removal a new tension, like the sudden quiet between notes. We have had the shaping of words, of patience, of the mending of perception. We have had the attempt to protect what was broken. And the one who did that has been saying, without meaning to, the very things that reveal the architecture of the protection. Everything is known here, in parts. The question now is how the parts fit, and who moved them. He turned, with the smallest inclination, toward Mrs. Stratton. "Madame, you spoke of phrasing and of preventing spectacle. You asked for delay, and in that delay you taught others to speak of patience as if it were virtue. You arranged the idea of mending as a reflection, separate from the breaking, so that the observer would look at pause instead of at process. You thought the seam invisible, yet the one who was asked to speak of it placed the focus not on the frame, but on the movement that hid within, and that spoke. He did not pause for denial. He moved gently, like a man shifting a curtain to reveal a larger painting. Colonel Finch, you coordinate with influence. You tend loyalty, and yet those loyalties shift beneath the surface. You control perception as if tending a garden. You were careful to align, and yet in aligning you tied threads with Mrs. Stratton that suggest not coincidence, but strategy." Lady Dressford's fingers tightened around her fan. Poirot's glance flicked to her, and she gave a small inclination, acknowledging her place in the network without conceding. "And, Reverend Chalice," Poirot went on, "you framed the language that would allow the world to see patient delay as moral fortitude. You were taught by one who feared the broken would be seen unprepared, and in your teaching you laid bare the tension between urgency and concealment." He touched lightly the note again. "We are all acquainted with the sound of distraction. The false lead was that. The missing envelope was the next movement. The theft of the seal was the attempt to control the revelation when control felt slipping. All these are pieces. The final gathering is not to accuse one alone. It is to allow the web to reveal how the hands that moved the threads think they remain separate while the net tightens. In the next moments, I shall speak the sequence as it appears to me. I ask that each of you listen. Do not interrupt. If anyone wishes to add, they will have their turn after." The room held, the space between breaths filled not with silence, but with the expectation of a tide about to turn. Poirot's eyes, sharp and shining beneath their soft, patient lids, swept the circle once more, not to gather, but to ensure that each had been accounted for in the design he was about to unfold. Chapter 16. The reveal Poirot's voice when he finally spoke the sequence was not loud. It was the calm articulation of a man who had seen the pattern long enough to be certain, and whose pleasure was in the symmetry of exposing deception, not in spectacle. The room was taut as a drawn string. He turned slowly, deliberately, to the center of the circle, and began. Sir Reginald Haversham was a man about to discover a plan that would change his legacy without his informed consent. He had learned, through pieces of language, through the shaping of donation phrasing, through the subtle alignment of loyalties, that certain persons intended to align his great gifts and influence in directions that would bind those who sought power under the appearance of charity. Mrs. Stratton, Colonel Finch, and Reverend Chalice were, together, crafting a frame. The one who advised the language, the one who cultivated loyalty, the one who softened the perception. That is the web. But the spider who struck was the one who believed the net would collapse if his hand were exposed. That man is Colonel Finch. A faint, involuntary shift passed through the room. Colonel Finch's face remained composed, but a small tightening appeared at the corner of his mouth, like a muscle preparing to defend itself. Sir Reginald, Poirot continued, had unease. He believed someone was moving behind the polite facade. He wanted to speak. He was interrupted, not by an intruder of brute force, but by a gentle signal. That signal was the reflected light placed so that he would glance toward the lower path. It was a minor thing, easily dismissed as nothing, and yet enough to tilt his attention. In that pause, Finch used a small sachet, hidden within the carriage's velvet interior, containing a fine powdered poison. It was not visible as a wound because the method was to introduce the agent by inhalation, a faint, exhaled breath catching in the throat, leaving no mark in the first instant. The carriage's hesitation was part of the design. Finch, knowing Sir Reginald would lean slightly, used the delay and the moment of intended speech to place the sachet within the seat's curve so that the air Sir Reginald drew would carry the toxin, slow, subtle, causing the expression of perception frozen between intention and interruption. He believed the death would appear natural, the carriage merely a coincidence, and that his alliances would secure the shaping of Sir Reginald's legacy without scandal. Poirot turned to Colonel Finch. "You are the one who feared exposure most. You believed that if Sir Reginald spoke, the foundation you tended with Mrs. Stratton would fracture. You managed to orchestrate the appearance of the pause. And you used the carriage's demonstration to conceal the act. You then used worry, fed to Mr. Langley through careful suggestion, to distract, making him the convenient screen. When the broken envelope, which contained proof of the planned alignment and Sir Reginald's intention to alter it, was noticed, you and your allies sought to control its narrative. The one who mended the broken seal, the one who wished delay, was not the murderer, but the one who feared the revelation of complicity. That is why the envelope was resealed. The theft of the seal was your attempt to control the future exposure by removing the very symbol that connected the broken with the mended, to keep the tension from revealing the disparity in handling. You believed taking it would silence the truth. Instead, it highlighted the desperation. Colonel Finch's eyes flicked briefly to Mrs. Stratton, as if seeking assurance. She remained still, a practiced mask. But the faint color that had been in her cheek the previous day was now a paler tone, the first real crack of concern. Poirot inclined his head toward Mrs. Stratton. "Madame, you did not kill him. You arranged the frame and sought to manage revelation. You taught the vicar how to speak of patience as virtue, so that delay would be accepted, and the broken thing would not be examined too closely. That is why Reverend Chalice's remark, which seemed a general reflection, was precise enough to become the final piece. It allowed the idea of the seam to be aired without the name of the mender being used. You attempted to protect control, not content." He turned then to Reverend Chalice. "You were the messenger. You gave language to the fear of exposure, and in doing so you revealed not only the intention behind the protection, but the direction of the protection. You unwittingly showed how the one who had the greatest reason to delay, the one who feared the revelation of the conspiracy, sought to make patience appear noble. That gave me the last piece. Who had enough anxiety to control both visibility and timing? The one who would strike when delay might fail. Lady Dresford, whose own influence had been noted in alignment with the network, and who had been watching with guarded patience, now leaned slightly forward. her eyes on Colonel Finch. The first one to make the connection aloud in a quiet tone. He thought he could manage everything, she observed. He believed the carriage would be a diversion, and that by choosing the moment, he kept the frame intact. Poirot gave a small, satisfied nod. Yes, the murder was not random. It was a design of prevention. Finch believed that if Sir Reginald altered his public statement without their hidden alignment, if he exposed the dependents and reshaped the legacy, the power structure they had built would collapse. He acted in desperation masked by foresight. The false lead offered by Langley was convenient for Finch. It drew eyes away while the real plan, the control of the narrative around Sir Reginald's intentions, could continue to be shaped. The theft of the seal was the attempt to control the aftermath. To remove the visible link between what was broken and what was hidden. He was wrong about the silence. The small things, reflections, hesitation, the difference between breaking and mending, spoke loud enough to guide us. Colonel Finch's composure cracked, just barely. "You have no proof," he said, voice low, a tremor of anger and fear. He was changing his mind. He would have left it. It was not necessary. You have taken coincidences and made a story. Poirot's expression did not shift. "You have given me patterns, monsieur. That is all the proof a mind that hides must reveal. Your hands, your careful direction of Mrs. Stratton, your over-attention to loyalty, the attempt to hide the broken with the mended, and then, when that failed, the theft. You believed you had orchestrated delay. You did not anticipate that the one who watches small seams would see the difference in the pressure and the fear that drove the action. The poison was quiet. The motive was loud. That is the combination of the clever and the desperate." Colonel Finch's shoulders drooped imperceptibly, and in that moment the room, which had been waiting, seemed to breathe. The revelation lay before them, not as a flourish, but as a rigid, inevitable truth. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. Colonel Finch's face, which had held through so many careful adjustments the mask of control, now sagged in a way that betrayed the fatigue of a man who had kept too many tensions taut at once. His eyes darted briefly to Mrs. Stratton, as if seeking a thread of rescue, but her gaze held, not with warmth, but with the clear realization that her own carefully arranged frame had been compromised. Reverend Chalice's expression was one of quiet shame. He had played a role as intermediary in smoothing words that hid the sharp edges of intent. Lady Dressford sat with her fan still, eyes narrowed not in condemnation, but in cold calculation. She understood that the balance of influence had shifted, and that the structure she had once considered a coalition was now a fracture, revealing deeper cracks. Inspector Grady, who had listened to Poirot's methodical unraveling of the design, finally spoke with the authority of the law matched with the weight of gathered truth. "Colonel Finch," he said, "you will come with me. You are under arrest for the murder of Sir Reginald Haversham." Finch's first impulse was denial, a reflexive tightening of the jaw. "You have no evidence of the murder," he protested, voice low and trembling. He was a man of power. He changed his mind. He might have altered everything. "You are building a story out of coincidences and turning loyal advice into conspiracy." Poirot, whose little gray cells had already placed the last shiver of guarantee, stood and stepped a fraction closer. "Monsieur Finch," he said gently, "coincidence is a comfort for those who fear being seen. You used the pause as a weapon, and you disguised your hand with loyalty and care. You thought the removal of the seal would silence the connection between the urgency of the break and the attempt to delay exposure. Instead, you gave us a conversation between panic and control. You placed the powder, the subtle sachet, so that breath would carry death like a whisper. That is not coincidence. That is design. Your motive was to preserve a structure that would have collapsed if Sir Reginald had spoken freely. That design you called foresight. The law calls it murder. There was a moment when Finch, pressed by the weight of inevitability, tried to shift the burden, casting a glance toward Mrs. Stratton, as if she were the architect. She did not move. The fragile alliance, which had been held together by mutual benefit, peeled quietly under the exposure. Finch's defenses, those last bastions of rhetoric and carefully curated indignation, crumbled like dry mortar. "I did it," he said finally, the words coming out not as a dramatic confession, but as the tired acceptance of a man who has been caught in a net he himself wove. He was going to ruin everything. He would have exposed me, and with me you would have seen the collapse of the causes we supported, philanthropy that needed order, loyalty that needed shaping. You think you have taken a moral high ground, Poirot, but you have unmade a plan that would have given so much. His voice faltered, the rationalization dissolving into the quiet truth. I thought I was saving it. I was only saving myself. Inspector Grady moved forward, placing the soft but firm hand of authority on Finch's arm. "You will explain it to the courts, Colonel," he said. "There will be a trial. You will answer for the manner in which you twisted guardianship into control and control into murder." Finch's shoulders, which had been rigid, drooped. He offered no resistance as he was led away, the carefully constructed loyalty that had been his shield now silent as a collapsed arch. The others remained seated, letting the movement pass like a tide drawing back, revealing the bed beneath. Poirot turned then to Mr. Langley. "You, mon ami, are free," he said softly. "You were a convenient screen, not the actor. The tension placed upon you was a shadow by design. The real hand was elsewhere. I trust you will find a way to rebuild what was strained, for the world will not see your name dragged through the mud if I can help it." Langley's relief was visible, but so was wariness. "I am grateful," he said, "and ashamed. I allowed the worry to become the stage for others. I did not see my own role in feeding it." "You were played," Poirot corrected gently. "Now be careful who you trust. Some alliances are built to crumble once they serve their purpose. Mrs. Stratton, whose influence had been exposed not as direct violence, but as the manipulative shaping of the perception, remained composed. Yet the thin mask of control had fissures. She knew that her arrangements, her careful phrasing, would be subject to scrutiny. Poirot addressed her last. "Madame," he said, "you protected delay like a gardener protects a bud, fearing the harshness of sudden reveal. You believed the broken would harm the plan if shown. You hid behind virtue and patience. That is not innocence. The law may not take you as the one who struck, but justice, in its broader sense, asks, to what end did you shape what should have been truth? You will choose now whether to assist or to defend. The path of transparency is the one that heals most quietly." Reverend Chalice, whose soft parables had been used to frame patience as noble while masking intent, looked suddenly older. "I was wrong," he said quietly, to no one in particular. "I thought I was helping strength endure. I only made a shadow more comfortable. I will speak plainly now." Lady Dressford, who had been the part of the alignment of influence with a subtle hand of her own, did not speak. Her silence was not acceptance. It was calculation, the slow reassembling of her own position in light of the collapse around her. Poirot gathered the room with a final glance, each person bearing the trace of their involvement, some in guilt, some in relief, some in the uneasy space in between. The truth, he said, is a thing with many faces. It does not always bring peace. Sometimes it unsettles a carefully laid order. Justice, however, is not merely the making of consequences. It is the unearthing of what has been buried under the illusion of control. Sir Reginald is gone. That cannot change. What remains is what is built from honest foundations. Let us hope the next alignments will not be so artfully tangled. He turned to Inspector Grady. You will present the case as you must. I will help delineate the patterns. The public will need an explanation that does not sour their trust entirely in those they admired. We shall allow some dignity to remain, so long as the truth stays clear. That is the outcome. The gathering dissolved shortly thereafter. Finch was taken to await the formalities of charge. Langley was released with a cautious escort. Mrs. Stratton and Reverend Chalice retreated into the quiet of reflection. Lady Dressford returned to her semblance of grace. Her own future alliances shifted subtly by what had passed. Poirot and I remained a moment longer in the emptied room, the echo of voices settling like dust. He is punished, I said quietly. He is, Poirot agreed. But punishment is only part of justice. The others, those who wove and those who softened, must decide what to become now that the net's pattern is visible. That is the true consequence. Chapter 18. The closing remark. The drawing room, once full of shifting alliances and quiet tensions, had become a place of muted occupation. The grand curtains, drawn partly aside to let in the pale autumn light, cast latticed patterns over the rugs, as if the room itself were still thinking in shadows. The formalities would follow, the trial, the statements, the public version of events carefully smoothed, so that the scandal would not rupture the reputations beyond repair. Poirot, ever aware that the world preferred its truths wrapped in palatable narratives, had already provided Inspector Grady with a version of events that balanced clarity with, as he himself put it, the preservation of that which is useful for the future, while not protecting the guilty. The others had retreated to their private reckonings. I remained near him as he prepared to leave St. Aubin. He had summoned no fanfare. His departure would be, as always, a quiet slipping away that left other people's lives rearranged in its wake. He stood by the window, looking out over the garden where the carriage path curved like a question mark, ornament and instrument both, now an artifact of tragedy and revelation. Mon ami, he murmured, turning to me, the human heart is a curious instrument. It wants order, yes, but it prefers the illusion of being in control. Colonel Finch believed he could shape the future by pressing small things into place and controlling their visibility. He did not understand that the smallest unplanned breath, the hesitation, the reflection, the choice of a word, can undermine the greatest architecture of intention. He acted with what he thought was nobility of preservation. It was only selfishness wearing a coat of benevolence. I nodded. And the others? Mrs. Stratton, Reverend Chalice, Lady Dressford. They were part of the framework, some by design, some by inclination. Do you think they will change? Poirot's little gray cells turned, and for the first time in memory, I heard the faint sound of something like regret beneath his carefully modulated voice. Change, oui, but not transformation. Madame Stratton will not abandon her shaping. She will perhaps speak more plainly now, because she has seen that concealment can crack. The Reverend, he will try to soften truth less, because he has seen that softening can serve manipulation. Lady Dressford, she is the most interesting. She has lost a partner, and her network is not yet broken. She will adapt. That is the difference between those who build coalitions for influence and those who build for consequence. She will choose new alignments. Whether they are better or worse depends on what she fears more, exposure or irrelevance. And Mr. Langley, I asked. He was almost consumed by the pattern placed upon him. He is a good example of a man who was used as a screen, and now must decide whether to become a clearer lens. Poirot's eyes softened a little. He has seen how easily worry becomes accusation, and how easily loyalty becomes manipulation. If he chooses carefully, he might rebuild not only reputation, but a better sense of whom to trust. The world will not remember his name with the same suspicion because the real culprit is known. That is a kindness the truth affords to the innocent, caught midstream. We stood in silence. The quiet of the room was not unpleasant. It was that of a place having been cleared of dust, still holding the scent of what had passed, but ready again for new use. Poirot placed a small, folded note on the table, near the empty place where Sir Reginald's chair had once been. It was addressed, in his precise hand, to Inspector Grady, not for accusation, but for guidance, a suggestion of how to present the subtlety of motive without losing the public to speculation. He straightened, smoothing the front of his coat with the tiny, practiced motion he used when preparing to leave presents behind. "And you, Hastings," he said, with that delicate mixture of warmth and the faint self-mockery he reserved for me, "you have been a witness and a participant. You have seen how the mind of man can build labyrinths in the name of preservation. Do not let your own little gray cells become too indulgent in imagining motives where simplicity might reside. The temptation is strong after one has seen such complexity. Remember, the truth is not always intricate. It is only the false that needs layers." I smiled, and in the smile was the understanding that the game would go on. People would always build frames, and some would always try to protect them. Poirot tipped his head, a small gesture of farewell, and then turned toward the door. Before stepping out, he paused, an image caught in the reflection of the glass, a small, wry twist of his mouth. Not quite a smile. "You know, Hastings," he added lightly, "the thing that pleases me is that after all this, the carriage still sits. It is a piece of innocent amusement again, is it not? People will speak of it as remarkable, and they will not know it carried a breath that almost ended a life. Such is the secret life of ordinary things. One must respect them. I watched him glide down the corridor, the soft click of his shoes on the polished floor like the punctuation of a sentence. Outside, he paused once, looking back, not at me, but at the house where the ghosts of intention still moved beneath the ordinary. Then he stepped into the light, and the day swallowed his figure as if it had been part of the arrangement all along. The affair at St. Alban closed in official records with neat summaries, with careful language about a tragic misunderstanding, turned to the uncovering of a calculated act, and with mentions of influential figures reconsidering their public strategies. The deeper intricacies remained, as most of them do, between those who had lived them. I, who had chronicled the progression, kept the memory not as a trophy, but as a reminder of how the smallest human impulses, fear, protection, ambition are shaped into vast patterns. As we drove away from the manor, Poirot leaned back slightly, eyes half closed, and said, in that soft tone which carried the weight of his own inner logic, "The mind, Hastings, is like a garden. You water what you value, but sometimes the weeds you plant to protect the flowers grow too tall. One must cut carefully, otherwise the beauty you intended to preserve is the very thing that strangles." I did not reply, only took in the landscape. The carriage path disappearing behind us like a question not wholly answered.